I'm fortunate to have been working on and looking at issues around climate change in Cleveland for a while. I have been doing a lot of research on this topic. I'm from Cleveland, from Cuyahoga County, but now live in Buffalo. I tell everybody in Buffalo that I live on the far east side of Cleveland. To them, it's not the funniest thing in the world to think that Buffalo is a suburb of Cleveland, but it is great to stay in the region and work on some of these issues. When I'm going through this topic today, I'm going to try to make it as interesting and as lively as possible. I know though that I'm a college professor, and so I've watched many of my students fall asleep during presentations at all different points. So if there's anything I can do to make it more lively, or you have any questions as we're going through the process, please let me know, because especially on a Saturday morning, you really have to have some high energy to make sure everybody's engaged and excited about these things. So the things that we're going to talk about today, there's three parts to this presentation. The first thing is I'm just going to give a brief overview of the science behind climate change, some of the key terms, and briefly introduce the Cleveland Climate Action Plan. Like I said, that's in the back of the packet here. We obviously, in the short time that we have, can't go through all the details of those things, so there will be some required reading, but I promise no quizzes at any point in the future. We're also going to talk a little bit about the some of the changes in the local temperature, precipitation patterns that we're expecting to see in Cleveland, and also some of the extreme weather that's actually happened around the county. And finally, the third and last part of the presentation is we're going to talk about the impacts of climate change on public health and other issues like water quality, food, forests, energy, transportation, and last but not least, fish and wildlife. So the first part, though, is we're just going to talk briefly about some of the background of about climate change, just to make sure everybody's on the same page. So two of the key terms that always come up when folks are thinking about climate change is what's the difference between weather and climate. So weather is really the short-term changes in the atmosphere, what we experience day to day. Like right now, we're all sitting and looking out the window at the beautiful weather that's sitting out there. That's the day-to-day kind of experience. When we think about climate, though, it's what happens with the weather when you add all of that up over long periods of time. And usually from the kind of meteorological or climatological community, not an easy word for me to say, you're looking at that at 30 or more years. So you're not looking at the things that are happening in the short term, because you can have changes that are shorter term patterns. You're really looking at over long term, how things are beginning to change. You probably have heard a lot of the term of greenhouse gases being related to climate change. Greenhouse gases directly relate to something called the greenhouse effect. And we're actually really fortunate to have greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, because it actually makes the Earth a habitable place to live. If we didn't have these gases in our atmosphere, we would actually be more like the moon, and there would be no warmth on the planet. What the greenhouse effect does is it actually takes the sunlight that's coming in and traps some of that radiation and keeps the planet warm enough for us to have life on it. The problem is when you change the composition of different types of gases that are in the atmosphere, and it's important to say less than even 1% change in that, it really dramatically begins to warm things up and trap more of that heat on the Earth's surface. And that's really what is causing what we call climate change or global warming, is that change in the types of gases that we're beginning to put in the atmosphere. There are 6 different types of gases that we're concerned about. Everybody's probably heard of carbon dioxide as being one of the most important ones. But there are other things like methane, which is something like is a main component of natural gas. So when they're drilling natural gas, it actually gets released into the atmosphere. That's a tremendously bad thing for global warming. But there are other things related to industrial processes that also add to the total greenhouse effect. Other terms, what's the difference between global warming and climate change? So global warming is when we look at the entire atmosphere of the Earth and how that's slowly beginning to warm over time. That's the global warming. It's the warming of the Earth's atmosphere. And that slow temperature change that happens over time, which right now is on the order of about 1 degree for the entire planet, is what causes the local climates to change at a location. So when you think about the warming of the entire Earth is slowly over time making much more dramatic changes happen in specific locations. And what we're obviously worried about is what are things that are going to happen to Cleveland, but it's it's really important to point out that all of these things are actually sort of tied together. That's something that's happening in other places. If we're not reducing greenhouse gas emissions, it actually potentially is coming back and impacting things that are also happening here. So climate change then is any significant change in the climate when measured over an extended period of time. And usually, like I said, it's more than 30 years. And those climate changes, those local effects, are the changes in the temperature, the humidity, our rainfall and precipitation, and wind patterns that we have in a location. And so this graph, I'm promising not to put too many graphs up this morning, because that's pure death for putting everybody to sleep. But the thing I want to point out is in the Midwest, since about 1900, we've actually seen about 1 degree of warming in the whole region of the Midwest. And how this is done is when you look at the averages over time, which is the line that's actually listed here, you're measuring against that average over the 1900 to 1960, over 60 years. So when you look at that over time, it's actually warmed a little bit. And although it might not seem like much, 1 degree change, that actually changes a lot of things in our atmosphere, changes a lot of different natural systems, and we're going to get into much more detail about that in a little bit. So why do we want to act on climate change? Why do we want to look at this as an issue? We certainly want to do it from the standpoint of we don't want to have irreversible changes in the climate that cause damage to a lot of different systems or obviously to people. But also there's a tremendous opportunity for local job creation and economic development. And the points that I'm going to go through here are actually the points that are in the Cleveland Climate Action Plan. One of my favorite cartoons shows a picture of a guy standing up and lecturing about climate change, and he's pointing out that every single thing that you're trying to do in terms of having renewable energy or having energy efficiency, all of those things create jobs and make the world a better place, even if climate change wasn't going to happen. And that's really the message I think we want everybody to take away from here. These are all good things to do anyway. You don't just have to do them for the climate. So when we talk about doing energy efficiency or we talk about bringing wind turbines or things like that to Cleveland, those are obviously bringing new jobs to the location. I think especially after this last winter, everybody would like to have lower utility bills. Yeah. So I have to say, living in Buffalo, we actually had the worst winter I've ever possibly imagined. I thought I understood snow until I saw 7 feet of snow fall in 4 days. So makes Cleveland look like, you know, a paradise of snow compared to what we had. But all of these things like energy efficiency obviously reduce utility costs for homes, for businesses, and also for the local government. As we're looking at making investments in our neighborhoods, it helps to reduce the risk of negative things happening to our communities, but it also adds some resilience to the types of extreme weather like snowfall, which unfortunately is projected to actually increase in the future. I get to be the bearer of a lot of bad news in some ways in a little bit in the future. Makes healthier, more comfortable homes. Improves air quality, public health, and quality of life. Improves water quality in Lake Erie and other streams and lakes that we have. And I think the most important thing and what we're working in the neighborhoods with and working with all of you folks is it's an empowered population with the tools to take action at homes and in neighborhoods on these different types of topics. So if you look at that Cleveland Climate Action Plan at some point in the future, my favorite quote that's in that document says that even if climate change was not a factor, taking those actions that are laid out in the Climate Action Plan would still make sense from an economic, environmental, and equity perspective. And the fact that we have climate change only adds urgency to acting now. And that's the message I think we want to keep talking about today. A lot of these things are just good ideas in general, but they also have net benefits in terms of reducing temperatures in neighborhoods, reducing flooding, or other kinds of negative things at a point in the future. 2 key terms that I want to talk about and make sure that everybody understands in the climate change community, and this document is actually, this image is also from the Climate Action Plan. There are a couple of key terms. The first one is mitigation on the left, which is the actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. So when you think about trying to put insulation in your home to reduce its energy use, the net effect is that, right, it's going to actually reduce the amount of power plant emissions going in the atmosphere. A lot of what we're talking about today is adaptation, which is we have these expected changes in the future, and we want to get out in front of those to make sure that there are no negative net effects. The sweet spot for those things are how do we find things that are good ideas for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, slowing global warming, but also thinking about the future of Cleveland. Where are the things that are in the center of that have those types of actions? And that's what I think we're going to talk a little bit about today. So the second part of the presentation I wanted to share with you is some of the expected changes in the local temperature, precipitation patterns, and some of the extreme weather that we're expected to have in the future due to climate change. So I've been working over the last couple weeks to try to get information and measured information about how the climate has actually changed in Cleveland. And although I said a couple of minutes ago that for the whole Midwest, the temperature has only shifted about 1 degree Fahrenheit, I think the shocking thing for Cleveland is that from 1956 to about 2012, the temperature has actually changed here on average by about 2.4 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's about 3 times the global rate of global warming, and it's obviously about 2.5 times what we've actually seen in the Midwest.
Do you think that's because we're an industrial city of 60 to 2,000 less than before that? I mean, why would we be so unique?
So partially why we're unique is the great question of what's going to happen to the Great Lakes. So we're really in many ways tied to what happens to Lake Erie, and as a shallow lake, it changes our temperature pretty dramatically. That's one of the big hypotheses about why this may be different than what's happened in the rest of the Midwest or places where we have much deeper lakes. But the other thing that happens is around the places where you measure, there's also changes in these measurements are all taken at Burke Lakefront Airport. So if you have more development, it actually heats up where the temperature measurements are taken. Asphalt, absolutely. Certainly warms up those places. So although this may not be a measurement of just how the climate itself has changed, it is a really good measurement of how the city of Cleveland has changed. And that's an important thing we'll talk about later. Temperature distributions are different neighborhood to neighborhood. Some neighborhoods are warmer than the other. I think everybody intuitively knows as you get closer to the lake in the summertime, it's a lot cooler. And part of some of the strategies that we want to talk about are how can we lower temperatures in the future in some of these places.
When you said that, how is it that maybe a couple of blocks down the street it will rain, but further down it would not be raining? And we are on the same side of town, and we're just a couple of blocks from each other. How is that possible?
So it's a great. So that's a really. So there are. So one thing I have to say up front is I'm an architect. Okay. So my meteorological explanations may not be the best thing in the world. One of the important things about all measurements of temperature is a measurement of how much energy there is in the atmosphere. So when it's warmer, there's more energy. So when you have areas that have maybe more asphalt, there's more heat that's being put up in those locations, and it can actually drive more severe storms. And they have done some research, mostly in Atlanta, in saying that some of the areas that have more pavement have actually had more tornadoes in some of those places. But the evidence they haven't quite figured out if that's 100% certain yet. But certainly what's happening in neighborhoods is directly related to how warm it is in those kinds of locations. So,
Thank you.
Sure. So even though I said that it's already warmed from 1956 to about the present by 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit, the scary thing is when you look at the climate models for the future, we're actually potentially going to see a lot more additional warming. So as you look out in the future, what's now only about 25 years from now, we have the potential to have about 4.5, 5 degrees more of warming. And it puts our climate here into something that is more like Tennessee or further south than what we actually have here. And as you can imagine, that really changes for Cleveland, which is its identity is kind of a northern city, is a cold climate city. We may have a very different environment going forward in the future. As I mentioned just a minute ago, temperature really drives a lot of different things happening in the environment. So temperature is directly related to rain and rainfall and snowfall. And so as you guys all know, when it gets really cold, all of a sudden, a lot of times that'll be when the rain rain happens in a certain location. As we've had this increase in temperature, that warmer air is actually able to hold more moisture and then drop it back down in the form of increased rainfall or increased snowfall in the wintertime. I think the most shocking statistic I saw was that the total amount of precipitation that we have in Cleveland has increased by 25.8% since the mid-1950s. And most of that rainfall is actually now occurring, or precipitation is occurring in the fall. And a lot of that is coming as more lake effect snow. And that's actually increased close to 60%. And I can say from living in Buffalo and living through 7 feet of snow, a lot of that has to do with as our lake gets warmer in the summertime, it holds a lot more heat. And in the winter, when we have the colder air pass over it, we see a lot more lake effect snow and we see a lot more heavy rains. And those lake effect snows and those rains are what do a tremendous amount of damage to our roads, but also to our homes and businesses and neighborhoods. Again, the sort of bad news about that is looking into the future, we're expected to see additional rainfall and additional snowfall because of a changing climate, something on the order of about a 10% increase beyond what we've already seen. The big question and the thing that a lot smarter climate scientists than anything I could ever do don't understand and are trying to work through is what happens with Lake Erie and how does that start to drive increased snowfall in the winter. Because certainly eastern locations moving up the lake, like the east side of Cleveland, Erie, and Buffalo, New York, potentially will see a lot more snowfall.
It's Canada challenged, huh?
Yeah. So I mentioned temperature and I mentioned precipitation. Both of those things really can come in the form of extreme snowfall or extreme rain doing damage. The top left image is of Doan Brook during one of these extreme rainfall events. Obviously that does a lot of damage in terms of erosion, but the floodwaters that you have are not pure clean water. They pick up everything from the asphalt, everything from the neighborhood, and everything is in that water. And so what they leave behind is really a nasty residue that you don't want to have near your homes and businesses. So how we think about flooding and also how we think about snowfall happening in the future. This is Buffalo. This was our November. We had a week off of work because no one could go anywhere. Obviously this can start to do a lot of damage to homes, but when you think also about emergency management and how people respond in these situations, how do people get their medication? If people have to go to the doctor for different things like having kidney treatments or stuff like that, like how do you make those things happen when you have these extreme events? And Cleveland has not been immune, although we aren't at the coasts and the Kresge Foundation has done most of its funding on the East Coast and the West Coast. We do have a lot of things that have happened to Cleveland. The biggest thing in terms of cost over the last 20 years has been those winter storms, but we've also had some tremendous flood events that have cost the county over $100 million. But you can see in these things that are specific to the county, it can do a tremendous amount of damage to everything. So the third part of the presentation is just some of the impacts of climate change on some different sectors like public health, water quality, food. As Terry mentioned a minute ago, the heat wave in Chicago, that was in 1995. I was actually doing roofing in Independence, Ohio that summer. It was like one of the hottest summers we've ever had here as well. But in Chicago, over 700 people actually died during that 1 week of the heat wave. And believe it or not, heat waves actually kill more people every year than any other type of natural disaster. Part of the reason we don't know about this more is because it doesn't leave behind any infrastructure damage. There isn't something that's photogenic for the Cleveland Plain Dealer to pick up. In fact, in the middle of the Chicago heat wave, the only pictures that were being taken were of refrigerated trucks that had to be brought to the morgue to hold all of the bodies. But when you look for other images of those kinds of things, right, they don't show up in the news, and oftentimes a death from a heart attack or a stroke doesn't get reported as being heat related, it just gets reported as being related to some kind of medical condition. I'm happy to say, well, I'm not happy to say, but this is the first time that this information has been presented, and it was by Scott Sheridan, who's at Kent State University and working on our project. He's been looking at, in Cleveland specifically, what happens as the temperature changes when we have extremely hot days on the right side or extremely cold days on the left side. What changes to the number of deaths in the city and in the county? And you can see on the right, When it goes much warmer than about 80 degrees in metropolitan Cleveland, you have a lot of increased deaths at those temperatures. And on the most extreme days, when it gets up over or near 100 degrees, you have almost a 50% increase in the number of people that can succumb to heat. That also happens in the wintertime on the extreme cold days as well, but it's not as severe. And part of this is I think people in the north are a little bit more used to having cold weather. They know what to do in those kinds of situations, but the extreme heat is something that we're maybe not used to. Yep.
Are you going to end up seeing more extreme cold like we had this year? Like you talked about a lot more snow days for Buffalo. My kids have a lot of cold days for Cleveland. Are we going to see more of that on the other end of the spectrum?
So that's like the million-dollar question for the Northeast and the Midwest. They really are unsure, I think, right now of exactly what's going to happen to the cold that we have. One of the theories they have is that when we have normal weather, the jet stream actually holds kind of the cold weather up towards the North Pole. When you don't have that protection, it allows that cold air from Canada to kind of, I feel like a broadcaster now, cold air from Canada pushes down. So we've had 2 years, of cold weather. Yeah, right. We've had 2 years of kind of unseasonably cold weather in the wintertime. As I mentioned, though, from a climate pattern, you're really looking at something more like 9-10 years before you'd start to say that it's a trend. So.
Because I imagine you'd see all the same effects, worse conditions on the roads, more deaths from cold, and less productivity and work.
Yeah. And one thing I want to point out on this graph is temperature affects people differently. So this graph is actually for folks who are over the age of 65. They can tend to be some of the most vulnerable populations in locations. A lot of folks are on fixed incomes that they have, so they may not be willing to turn their heat on. I have a 94-year-old grandmother who, keeps her house at an unreasonably cold temperature and then doesn't turn the air conditioning on in the summertime either in Cleveland. So how do you, begin to engage those populations to make sure everybody understands? But also, a lot of how our houses and the temperatures we feel indoors is by how well insulated they are. So how can we get into locations and think about making sure that people have insulation so that maybe the cost isn't as high to run some of these systems. One of the things with this changes in temperatures is we have actually seen an increase in the amount of days that we have over 90 degrees in Cleveland. It's gone up by about 4 days since 1960, and this is a trend that's actually projected to increase in the future. And 2012 was one of the worst years that we've had. We actually set, I think, 12 or 13 days in the summer of new highs that we'd never seen before. One of the points I made earlier, and I think one of the key takeaways from our workshop today, is that temperatures are not the same in all neighborhoods across Cuyahoga County or across Cleveland. So when you have places that have more paving, fewer trees, you have warmer temperatures in those locations because the pavement or businesses or roofs or things like that can store that heat and then re-release it later. So when you look a thermal map of Cuyahoga County, right, you can clearly see things like some of the different park systems, right? This is on the west side, the Rocky River kind of reservation. You can see things like the Cuyahoga Valley National Park, which actually is here, right? And you can actually see kind of at the top of the ridge line in Shaker Heights and Cleveland Heights where there tend to be more trees than on the east side of Cleveland. So how can we begin to reverse some of these trends so that you have cooler temperatures in some locations, right? In places like, especially like the Industrial Valley, what opportunities are there moving forward in the future? And I think it comes back to our neighborhoods, it comes back to our communities and how we have that actions at the neighborhood level and at the building level. So I think one of the only pieces of real good news I have is that we are expected to have warmer temperatures in the winter, which will mean lower heating bills at some point in the future if we don't have that unbelievable cold happening every year. Unfortunately, though, we are going to see a lot more air conditioning expenses in the future. And Cleveland actually has, only about half of people in Cleveland actually have access to air conditioning. So that's potentially a real problem going forward. Some of the things, though, like the stronger storms, warmer temperatures, and things from running off into our streams and rivers are potentially going to do a lot of damage to Lake Erie if we don't begin to correct some of those actions now. Although the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District is engaging in a huge project right now, we still have a lot of things that are happening from farming runoff and just also things from industrial runoff going into the lake. The negative impact of that is, everybody probably remembers last summer in Toledo, right? They actually had to shut down their water. I've been assured that that's not something that could happen in Cleveland or happen in Buffalo, but it does do a tremendous amount of damage to the Great Lakes. And you can actually see when you look at it from space, the scale of something like this is pretty phenomenal. And there are 11 million people in these cities that actually rely on Lake Erie for water. So we are all kind of tied together around these issues of water quality. Did you guys all see why I call Buffalo the far east side of Cleveland? Yeah. You guys will chuckle, but no one ever likes that joke in Western New York. So as I mentioned, the city, the regional sewer district has actually been spending a lot of money to dig a series of tunnels to begin to correct some of that water from being flowed off into the lake. Cleveland has an older sewer system where the sewage system and the stormwater runoff are combined into one system. And when you have these massive storm events, it actually just bypasses a wastewater treatment plant right into the lake. These tunnels are actually designed to hold all of this excess water that we're going to have in the future until a point when you can actually begin to treat it. But you still have other kinds of things that happen within the city. You have flash flooding, you have stream erosion, and things that can do a tremendous amount of damage. And like I said, most of this precipitation in the future is falling as extremely hard events. From kind of a cultural standpoint, or also how we experience our neighborhoods, a lot of the native tree species are expected to change over time. One thing I can say that will probably unify everybody in the room is everybody likes Ohio State, right? Is that fair? Yeah. So an interesting article from last fall was that in the future, in the very near future, buckeye trees may not actually thrive in Ohio because of warmer temperatures. So how do we think about what we're planting and bringing into neighborhoods, but also how do we think about reducing climate change so that things that are more important from just than a tree standpoint, but also from the culture of the Ohio State University, continues to stay in our locations. Some of these warmer temperatures will actually have positive effects on things like farming, but at the same time, the severe storms and things that we're expected to have will do more crop damage over time. And as we're already seeing with, on kind of a national scale, when you start to lose food production, like in California, which is really the breadbasket of most of the United States, it really affects local food prices. So do we need to rely more on urban agriculture or things in our backyards so that we can actually offset some of those losses? Staggering statistic I heard is that it takes for one almond, it takes 1 gallon of water to produce, right? So when you look at the entire state of California and all of those foods that we're kind of used to, those things potentially change in the very near future. From a public transportation and safety standpoint, obviously as we have flooding or snowfall or things like that, more potholes potentially in the future from freeze-thaw cycles, more than just a nuisance when we do have these events, how do you begin to have public services reach folks, as I mentioned, the snow, but also from flooding. You have increased costs for the city to begin to keep the snow off of the streets. You have damage to things like rail. So this is actually a RTA, a rapid transit line that washed out because of heavy flooding. How do we plan for those things in the future? But also just from a community standpoint, when you think about people trying to maybe go to a cooling center during a heat wave, how do they get to those things in those locations? These are all things that we have to think about. And finally, I think one of the last things is just that it really does start to change the type of fish and wildlife and things that we're used to seeing in our backyards in Cleveland. So certain types of, this bird, the bobolink, has a beautiful song. If I played it, I think everybody would probably recognize it as being something of the summer in Cleveland and Cuyahoga County. But as it gets warmer and as things change, we start to lose those things that make Cleveland, Cleveland. Yep.
How does planting crops versus planting trees affect the temperature around a vacant space per se? Because the crops, they won't have any canopy or anything to make the space cooler. So is it as beneficial to plant crops versus trees, or trees?
It's probably not as beneficial to plant crops as it is to plant trees, but when you think about the stresses on the food system at a national scale, there's a real value in that. So one of the things that we're actually looking at as part of our research is we have someone looking at all of the evidence for what food does in terms of reducing local temperatures, and hopefully we're going to have more of that information that we'll be able to share in the near future. So the three things I went through the presentation are the science of climate change. I gave you some of the key terms and also talked briefly about the Climate Action Plan. Also talked about the expected changes in temperature, precipitation, and also some of the extreme weather. And finally, just very quickly went through some of the different sectors and how climate change is expected to impact it. I think as we said at the beginning, nothing we're proposing, nothing we're thinking about for different neighborhoods is not a good idea. This goes back to things like the image from Reimagining a More Sustainable Cleveland that Linda mentioned a couple of minutes ago. But all of these things like weatherized homes, to reduce utility bills and reduce carbon dioxide emissions, right? Trees to provide shading, rain gardens to actually slow some of the water runoff, and then places for native species to actually thrive, can all fit into our work in the future. And Terry's going to talk a lot more detail about these things in a couple of minutes. But I think the most important thing is, most of us are not going to experience some of the worst things in the future in terms of changes in the temperature and the climate. So how do we think about engaging younger generations? And it is great to have you guys here today to help talking with things in the community, because this is something that's going to take a long term and over time to begin to make happen.